year ago, Father Miguel DeSoto, a liberation theology priest, the former foreign minister of Nicaragua, came to New York to democratize the United Nations as its new president of the General Assembly. Now, a year later, his term is over. He leaves a little saddened, a little frustrated, wondering, is it even possible to reform the United Nations? So you talk about reinventing the United Nations. So what would that look like? What concretely would you like to see?
Okay. The United Nations does not exist for itself or unto itself. It exists on behalf of an idea, of a dream, of a conception of the world that we want to strengthen. And such ideas are implicit or explicit, contained in the Charter. But it is absolutely undeniable that one of the reasons the United Nations hasn't worked is that some of its most influential and powerful members do not buy as applicable to themselves the principles therein contained. In fact, they defend and apply the law of the jungle. Might makes right. With those kinds of ideas, no wonder that the United Nations has not achieved the fundamental goals for which it was created. No one can deny it does a great many good things. But the fundamental things, it will be judged on the basis of whether or not it accomplished the fundamental objectives for which it was created. And there are basically two. The prevention of war is one, and the other one is the consolidating of a climate of security. And the founders interpreted that to mean that poverty had to be eradicated. If the United Nations is evaluated having those in mind, then you say, well, it has failed.
DeSoto believes that the power given to the Security Council, and in particular the permanent veto power vested in the governments of the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, are a major reason for the failure of the United Nations, a criticism he reiterated during his final speech as President of the General Assembly.
They think nothing of railing against multilateralism, proclaiming the virtues of unilateralism, while simultaneously pontificating unashamedly from their privileged seats on the Security Council about the need for all member states fully to conscientiously to fulfill their obligations under the Charter, or be sanctioned, selectively of course. But during this year, as President of the General Assembly, I have come to the conclusion that the time has already passed for reforming or mending our organization. What we need to do is reinvent it.
DeSoto is not alone in calling for a radical shift in the United Nations power structure. In fact, many heads of state use their podium time at the opening of the 64th session of the UN to call for just such action.
Não é possível que as Nações Unidas e seu Conselho de Segurança sejam regidos pelos mesmos parâmetros que se seguiram a Segunda Guerra Mundial. De uma ONU suficientemente representativa para enfrentar as ameaças de paz mundial por meio de Conselho de Segurança renovado, aberto a novos membros permanentes.
If the UN Security Council is not reformed and does not have permanent representation for Africa, the legitimacy of the Council's decisions will continuously be questioned.
Decisions are still made by the few for the many. The prime example of this is the UN Security Council. We continue to believe that reforming the Security Council including the eventual abolition of the veto, is critical if aspirations of equality of states is to be achieved.
Creo que hay muchas coincidencias escuchando a muchos presidentes sobre el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas. Necesitamos una verdadera democratización de las Naciones Unidas. Para eso planteamos lo siguiente: los miembros permanentes y eternos del Consejo de Seguridad, así como su derecho a veto, deben ser eliminados. No es posible que en el pleno siglo XXI sigamos con prácticas vitalicias y totalitarias de la época de las monarquías. Todos los países debemos tener los mismos derechos en las Naciones Unidas. Quienes se autoproclaman como líderes de la democracia deberían de renunciar a sus privilegios y aceptar la verdadera democratización del Consejo de Seguridad.
According to DeSoto, even the most radical Security Council reform won't go far enough because powers like the United States have means to influence the behavior of the General Assembly as well.
There are all kinds of pressure tactics and arm-twisting things where countries, for example, you have a pending request for a loan in the World Bank or Inter-American Development Bank or whatever, they can come and tell you, look, if you continue doing that, we promise that we will block that loan that you so desperately need.
Working alongside DeSoto in his year as President of the General Assembly was his niece and Deputy Chief of Staff, Sophia Clark DeSoto. She explained that aspects of the UN culture render reform and innovation improbable. Not many people have much insight into the United Nations, and you've had a pretty unique opportunity to see how the place works. In terms of someone coming in with this vision for change, what did Father DeSoto run into in terms of UN culture? How open is the UN culture itself to being reformed?
Oh, they're scared. They're scared. There's all kinds of turf wars here, and particularly if you're outside of the programs that have the big funding. If you're in peacekeeping operations or you're in peace building, you know, member states make their contributions to this organization, but they also earmark funds for their pet programs and the things that they want to get funding. And in fact, under the Bush administration, they actually blocked funds from certain programs that they didn't want you to be able to use US funding. So it's not like they just give to the organization to carry out its mandate. They have many other ways, insidious ways of coming in and controlling sometimes the real autonomy of agencies here, which should be able to have a greater say in how they do that. But you look at the problem with global food prices. You know, there's taboos here. When you begin to have problems in the different committees, they don't want to talk about subsidies that the Europeans put on their exports. There are certain issues they want. If you do it on a rights-based approach, you have to look at some of the structural issues. To constantly be promoting in front of Americans and in front of the media the threat of a nuclear Iran, which for all and purposes right now is a hypothetical, and not to talk about other nuclear powers in the region. I mean, there's a hypocrisy there that Father Miguel has no problem dealing with.
Meaning Israel.
Meaning Israel. But I mean, Israel, how many nuclear weapons do they have?
Another of DeSoto's goals as president was to make the UN more relevant by reacting quickly to important events. To this effect, he spearheaded a UN conference on the economic crisis in June, to which he invited all of the world's heads of states.
I remember being here in October, early October, when it was quite clear that this crisis was not going to go away, and that we realized, and he was the first one to say, you know, the truth is nobody knows how deep this is going to be, but we know it's big. And in fact, this is probably the biggest challenge this organization has faced since it was founded. And he was like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And it wasn't one of the 6 priorities that he'd established for the 63rd session. But I remember the morning he came into the office and he said, we're going to talk about it. And we're going to talk about it inside the General Assembly. Everybody talks about it in the hallways. Everybody waits to see what the G8 will do. Everybody waits to see what the G20 is. We're going to talk about it here because if we're going to be relevant, we have to talk about what's affecting the whole world. And there was a discussion here with the Secretary General's office, and maybe this isn't the time, you know, there's going to be a meeting in Washington, let's let them go first. He goes, no, we don't want them to go first. They're the ones who got us into this.
The G192 was thereby established as the most appropriate forum to address those issues that affect the international community as a whole. The G8 and the G20 will continue to be significant minorities. However, this is more due to the fact that they are rich and powerful than to their demonstrated ability to do things well. We cannot and should not forget that, after all, it is because of the extremely grave errors committed by them and the Bretton Woods institutions run by the G8 that the world is currently undergoing what could well turn out to be the worst crisis in history.
Despite asking all 192 heads of state to attend, only 14 were present, and the media largely ignored the event.
I think there was a feeling by Father Miguel, very personal level, that he failed. And it was discouraging to the rest of us, because we felt that even if you didn't have the heads of state that he might have liked. He coined the frame, the G192, that has caught on, and I hope that will be a legacy of his presidency, that they will remember that he brought them into the global discussion on the economic crisis.
But the sense of failure is that the heads of states didn't come to the conference?
He truly believed if we step up to the plate, we can really do something visionary. And because they didn't come, he took that as a reflection on his own inability to have been the messenger, that somehow he wasn't compelling enough, that he couldn't make them see what he thought was truly a historic opportunity. And I think in a very, very personal way, and he paid a very high price. It's an open secret here. His own constituency, I mean, he's coming from Latin America, he's coming from the group of the revolutionary left, his comrades who fought with him side by side, not very many of them came. And that also, I think, made him feel in a very, very personal way that he had failed.
Why didn't they come? They were expected.
I think a couple of things. One, because I think that there are many, many nations who really have very low expectations and don't believe that you can reform the United Nations, and don't believe that United Nations will respond in a meaningful way to the crisis and the way it's affecting them. So they wanted to look for regional responses and work among themselves, their own model, and forget the IMF and forget the World Bank. And his feeling was, that's great if you have certain resources. Some countries have, you know, it's easier for them to do. But there are many countries that is their only option. And what do we do about them?
And not everybody's sitting on a mountain of oil.
Not everyone's sitting on a mountain of oil. Not everybody has a direct link to that. And that this small island states, where do they go to? They end up falling under patrons. You know, and he wanted to be able to work so that they would feel they have other options, and that working together we can actually do more. And he really wanted to mobilize the South. It wasn't because he thought the Western powers will come. He thought if the whole South comes together as a bloc, they can't ignore us. But like I said, his constituency chose not to come. And so that was painful for him.
While the failure to guide the UN into leadership over the global economic crisis clearly affected DeSoto, it's the inability of the United Nations to bring about a resolution to the crisis in Palestine that has caused DeSoto the most pain.
My greatest frustration this year has been the situation in Palestine. The question of Palestine continues to be the most serious and prolonged, unresolved political and human rights issue on the agenda of the United Nations since its inception. The evident lack of commitment for resolving it is a scandal that has caused me much sorrow.
Join us for part 2 of our interview with Father Miguel DeSoto when we discuss the United Nations and Palestine.
while in Tehran.